show a clip now? Yeah, okay.
Light switch is right next to you, Lou.
Okay, that's a fairly inscrutable clip for you, but very, very interesting to me. As I told Bill, I really wanted to see it. Can you hear me? Okay, maybe I'll take off from that, because on the first case, I remember the day that Nixon made the comment about me that's quoted there, and I was met at an airport. I was coming back from somewhere, and Connie Chung, remember her? Who, I see there are people in this audience who do remember, and others who don't. But she met me at the airport somehow, and she said, "What do you think about Nixon calling you a punk this morning?" And I said, "Oh, I thought that was very restrained of him." I'm sure that he had many other words in mind that he chose not to use. And he definitely had been more interested in me than was good for him, it turned out. But on this last bit, which didn't mean too much to you, that's an extraordinary thing for me to see. And I'll tell you why. I understand a lot of you have seen this movie, Most Dangerous Man in America. How many have seen it? Quite about half. How many have not seen it? Okay, about half. So it's going to be shown tonight, right? It's a good movie, actually. But they were not, the people who did that, the documentary, were very interested in finding a clip like that of that particular rally. On the steps of the Capitol on May 3rd, 1972. And they weren't able. It seems as though all the records of that they could find had been destroyed by the various networks. It hadn't covered a lot at the time. There were a bunch of well-known Hollywood people who were against the war at that point. Donald Sutherland and Jane Fonda, Holly Near, a number of others actually were at that. And all the anti-war, a lot of the anti-war congressmen there, Ron Dellums, and Mike Gravel and others. Actually, it was a fairly significant moment. Maybe I'll go into that. But they weren't able to find a single clip. So when Bill told me, he said, "Where is that from? Actually, do you know what the program was or whatever?"
CBS or ABC News did a look back on the decade of the 70s.
Yeah. Well, what made it interesting, the fact that they had actually looked back and found Bernard Macho Barker in that, and I guess he's the only one that they identified, right? You thought they'd identified several others. He mentioned there were others there. All the people who were in the Watergate break-in later, just a couple of weeks later, were at that rally to get me, actually, quote, to neutralize Daniel Ellsberg. And the people who had been in my former psychoanalyst office, which they mentioned there, all the people who had been in that break-in earlier were also at this event, with orders, as the special prosecutor told me later, to incapacitate Daniel Ellsberg totally. And I said, I heard that, and I said to Bill Merrill, who was the prosecutor, "What does that mean? Tell me." He said, "Well, the words were to incapacitate you totally. But you have to understand, these guys, who were all CIA assets, some of them still on the CIA payroll, these guys never used the word kill." And again, the younger people here won't remember the context, but the older ones will remember the phrases like, what was it? Well, neutralize is one. Let's see, terminate with extreme prejudice. Remember that? Terminate with extreme prejudice as an order to kill. That was a double agent, actually, Special Forces double agent that they murdered. And they used various words, euphemisms for kill. He said, the prosecutor said he had no doubt that they intended to kill me. And actually, I do doubt that. I doubted at the time, even more later. I think they wanted to put me out of action, to incapacitate me, keep me quiet for a while, because that was on May 3rd, 1972. There was an offensive going on. This is a year after the Pentagon Papers had come out now, in June of '71. And so a year later now, we had a spring offensive, a very big offensive by essentially the North Vietnamese in South Vietnam, leading to the heaviest bombing of the war was going on at that point. And in fact, it's worth bringing up, I'll get some of the take off from this particular event because it encapsulated so much about that particular war and about the wars that are going on now and face us in perhaps coming months. A very similar situation. So I was talking about the fact that they were likely to mine Haiphong, the port of Haiphong at that time, which would bring us into direct conflict with Russian shipping, possibly result in the destruction of a Russian ship, bring us into conflict with Russians for the first time in the war. Who knew how they would react to that, and that might escalate further. Moreover, what I was especially concerned about was that I thought this mining of the Haiphong, which they did do just 5 days later on May 8th, 1972. So that was coming up, and it was a big secret. It was to be presented as a fait accompli, basically. I had actually been warning about this for a couple of years, but especially since the Pentagon Papers had come out a year earlier that this was going to take place, and would be accompanied by the B-52 bombing over North Vietnam for the first time. They had not sent B-52s over because of the Russian surface-to-air missiles, SAMs, which threatened the B-52s and could have brought some of them down. They didn't have those in South Vietnam. So the B-52s had been bombing in South Vietnam. Remember, this is the plane initially meant exclusively for nuclear war, but which had been converted to carry very heavy bomb loads and was being used over South Vietnam. And I knew that once they did the mining, which had been planned as early as '69, going back to the beginning of the Nixon administration, once they did the mining, they would accompany that with very heavy bombing of North Vietnam, and very possibly leading to the use of U.S. ground troops in North Vietnam, which I thought would bring the Chinese in. And in retrospect, that was likely to happen as a consequence. And that in turn would lead us eventually to the use of nuclear weapons against the Chinese, something we always. So I was extremely concerned that this mining would take place and this escalation would take place. And I've been warning about it, including to letters to the New York Times before the Pentagon Papers came out, as early as 1970. Okay, so the point is they wanted to present that as a fait accompli. They did not want, Nixon did not want to arouse any undue public opposition to that before it happened that might prevent him from carrying it out. So I was to be silenced, and I think really Bernard Barker, Macho, his nickname was Macho, who had been on the Bay of Pigs operation, along with the other Cuban Americans who were involved in this and all these actions, had been part of a special team of the Bay of Pigs people whose assignment, secret assignment, was to kill the more left-leaning members of the Bay of Pigs. And to get this spectrum here involved, the left-hand members of the liberals of the Bay of Pigs, some people who had been Castro followers to begin with and then had become disillusioned with Castro, but still had some what they call revolutionary strains left in them. And the idea was for Barker, for the right-wing people, the people we have in mind taking over when Castro dies and Cuba reverts to being an American colony, essentially. He was to kill, he and the others who were working with him on the burglary were to kill the more left-leaning members of the Bay of Pigs operation, which, for the young people here, which was the CIA-sponsored and equipped invasion of Cuba. So they were assassins, essentially. Another of this team was a guy named Frank Sturgis, who had been Castro's pilot for a while, but he was not one of the left-leaning people. And at the time, at this very time, was involved in a plot not only to incapacitate Daniel Ellsberg, but to kill Torrijos of Panama, who was standing in the way of a Nixon scheme to create a new Panama Canal type thing, not over Panama, but over Nicaragua, and possibly use nuclear warheads, nuclear devices, to build that canal. A sea level canal, essentially, would go through. So Torrijos was in the way of that somehow, and they were going to kill Torrijos. Now, he later did die in an American, in a crash that was almost surely engineered by Americans later, but not by these people, because they had been arrested for the Watergate. And as Bill was saying to me this morning, all of these people were people then who had been trying to assassinate Castro. I didn't mention that, but that's also the case, for years. And so as I said to Bill, that's why I'm here. It was the same team that they sent to assassinate Castro. And we were both blessed in our assassins. We were lucky in that respect. Okay, so they didn't incapacitate me. So this film clip then, which did not get in the film, The Most Dangerous Man in America, and they didn't tell that whole episode of trying to incapacitate me, which is fairly dramatic in itself, but they couldn't find any film for it. And so Bill has actually found it. It's quite amazing for me to see. And that they'd actually identified Barker as having been part of that. Now, they didn't get me at that time because, again, to explain the little clip there, the Cubans who were brought up for this job had shown my photograph and said, here's who you're going to get. And Barker had said later, my job, said Barker, was to break both his legs. And I think it was, even that wouldn't have silenced me. I think legs and jaw, I have a feeling, were scheduled to go for a while, so I could stop talking about the mining of Haiphong that was about to happen. So they didn't do that because they had been told as a cover story that Dr. Ellsberg, the mad Dr. Ellsberg, was going to infiltrate and disrupt the Hoover funeral that you just saw. And that they were to protect Hoover's catafalque from me and my minions. And as you may have noticed in the film, it was pretty well protected. I think they had the 82nd Airborne around it or something. Certainly the Park Police and the Secret Service and everything else. But the Hoover Memorial was taking place, the mourners were on the other side of the Capitol. And when I heard that Hoover had died, the rally we were in had been scheduled for some time, and that Hoover had died and was going to be lying in state, I said, well, should we cancel this or move it somewhere? He said, no problem, there'll be no interference. They're on that side of the Capitol, we're on the other side of the Capitol. So when the Cubans who had been brought up from Miami, this is getting complicated here, on the first use of the illegal campaign funds from Ken Dahlberg that was part of Nixon's impeachment process. The first use of that was to bring these people up from Miami to incapacitate them. And when their first move was they wanted to pay their respects to Hoover. He was a hero of theirs, essentially, even though some of them could not speak English very well, they were Spanish. But they did admire Hoover, and so they did go through the line for Hoover, and they noticed that it was on the other side of the Capitol on the one hand. So that was a little funny about the story they'd been told, which as usual, was a false cover story. And then, when they got in the crowd, they were deciding to get me. But one of them, Martinez, who had done 300 boatloads into Cuba as part of our covert operations against Cuba, 300, came to Barker, who was in charge of the operation, said in Spanish, Bernie, the people here don't like it when we call Ellsberg traitor. And I've actually heard the tape. Oh, another person was Judy Collins, who had a tape of this. She was singing that day. And I heard on the tape, Traidor, Traidor, as I'm speaking. And the crowd didn't like that, which suggested they weren't Hoover mourners somehow. And the Cubans had assumed that since I was infiltrating a crowd of Hoover mourners, all they had to do was take a swing at me and the crowd would join in, and tear me apart and be on their side. So Martinez said to Barker, in Spanish, the equivalent, there's something fishy about this. There's something wrong with this story. And so, as they said to her interviewer later, we were afraid we were going to be set up by the agency, their boss. They'd been fed a wrong story, which was true. We were being set up to be patsies, to be caught, like Oswald, they said. Funny little note there, footnote, for them to say. And so they backed off, and some of them got into fights, Sturgis in particular, into fights with people in the crowd. and were led off, were arrested by hard police who were there. So they didn't have to beat me up. And there's actually, Judy Collins actually noticed, Sturgis in particular, this guy, which she wrote a poem about in a song, The Man in a Sharkskin Suit. And later, when he was caught for the Watergate, she recognized him, having seen him beating up on a small person in the crowd. And they were let off by the police, and then two people, one of them with expired FBI credentials, well, actually they didn't admit it was expired, with FBI credentials, and another with CIA credentials. Obviously, Hunt from CIA retired, and Liddy retired, fired from the FBI, were using false credentials. And they said, these men are good Americans, we'll take charge of them. And they took them away from the police. And that night, Barker and others were shown their next objective, the Watergate. They did a reconnaissance of the Watergate. So when they were caught, then, on their second entry into the Watergate, a few weeks later, they had some crimes of the White House to spill if they wanted to bargain, or if they wanted to tell the truth to a grand jury, when the grand jury asked them what else they'd taken part in. So the president now was facing that he had people on trial with, he had also used in my doctor's office and in this event of trying to assault me, and other matters as well, crimes against me largely, and against some others, Ted Kennedy and some others they were following. So they had a lot, he had to keep them quiet. And to do that, he had to pay some of them off. Hunt in particular gave, I think, $140,000 to Howard Hunt, supposedly for lawyers' fees. But basically to keep them lying to the grand jury about what they knew of crimes of the White House. This is what John Dean said to Nixon was the cancer on the presidency. Remember that phrase? And what he's saying is, each thing we do here is another crime of obstruction of justice, which some people know about. And so more and more people know it's eating away, it's getting bigger. And someday somebody's going to talk. It turned out to be Dean himself, who in fact did reveal the break-in to the doctor's office and so forth, which confronted Nixon with possible impeachment, well, likely impeachment, and even possible prosecution, for which he escaped by being pardoned, being given a blanket pardon by Ford, who had taken the job of taking over from Nixon, having assured Nixon's aide Haig that he would pardon the president. Again, a clear-cut crime, actually, making promises of that sort in order to gain office. Okay, well, let me sum up what some of this has to do with. In order to pursue what was essentially a secret policy in Vietnam of ending the war basically by winning it in terms of Nixon's own objectives, not in the most ambitious sense that had ever been imagined of the Viet Cong laying down their arms and surrendering or giving up, but rather of a kind of outcome that would keep General Thieu, President Thieu, in office indefinitely, keep us in control of Saigon and the major cities, ceding essentially control of the countryside, the hinterland, to the Viet Cong, a kind of division, like Korea, but not as neat as Korea, division of the country, but what they called a leopard skin, a spotted kind of arrangement, where our regime would retain control of the cities, especially the ports and the cities and Saigon, and the Viet Cong would have the less populated parts of the rest of the country. And that would be assured by getting the North Vietnamese to take their troops out of South Vietnam, back to North Vietnam. They would do that, supposedly, under threat that they would be annihilated if they didn't, including by nuclear weapons. So, if necessary. So this is the secret plan. He did, after all, have a secret plan. That's been mocked, that Nixon campaigned in '68 with the implication that he had a secret plan for ending the war. And many people said, no, he was just saying that, he really didn't. In fact, he did. This was the plan. To threaten North Vietnam with escalation, including possible nuclear weapons, and certainly with heavy bombing, mining Haiphong, possibly invading North Vietnam, in order to get them to agree to leave us in control indefinitely of the major cities there, and especially Saigon, and to assure that by having the northern troops leave South Vietnam, and with the hope that our U.S. supplied, U.S. trained collaborative forces that were serving our interests essentially, or the Saigon regime, they would be able to handle any remaining revolutionary or liberation forces with the help of U.S. air support. So U.S. air support was to continue indefinitely an air war. Nixon had no intention of ending the war, though that's the words he used, we'll end the war honorably. No, we were going to end the U.S. ground combat part of the war, keeping the war going indefinitely with the U.S. air support and the bombs we supplied to the Saigon Air Force that we had equipped, paid, and the U.S. paid forces that were supporting the Saigon regime. That was the plan. I was sure, as of 1969, that plan, which I learned of secretly from my friends in the White House and in Vietnam, would not work. And I felt that the threats would not get them to leave. In fact, North Vietnam never came close to considering taking its forces out of South Vietnam. And what they considered, and most Vietnamese considered, the southern part of one country, of Vietnam. The constitutions of both North and South Vietnam, both of which are pretty much paper constitutions, but they both started with the notion Vietnam is one. They agreed on that. There is not two Vietnams, there is one Vietnam. And so the idea that the South was being invaded by foreigners, by people who were invading their neighbors, as Secretary Rusky put it, was a concept that no Vietnamese accepted, anti-communist, communist, in between, whatever. There was one country. So they were not about to give up the North's aims of unifying the country, and under their control, ultimately. They probably would have compromised on a quite long transition period once the U.S. troops left. But they weren't about to accept the indefinite existence of what amounted to a U.S. colony protected by U.S. air power. I thought that wouldn't work. So it meant the war would continue and would get larger, especially in the air. And that's actually what did happen. I was ready to do anything I could to avert that. An endless war in Vietnam, U.S. bombing Vietnam indefinitely. In fact, I described to my boss at RAND at one point what I understood to be Nixon's policy based on this secret information from Lord Halpern, who worked for him in Kissinger. And I said, he's going to get the U.S. troops down, not out, but down significantly. I think, by the way, I don't just think, it was my certainty, I felt, that he intended to keep 20, 30,000, 40,000 troops there indefinitely, U.S. troops, as advisors or whatever you would call them. Not get them out entirely, but essentially rely on the bombing to keep them there. And my boss, Harry Rowan, my friend, president of RAND, said, well, if he's going to get the troops down and U.S. costs down, which heavily depended on the troops, what's so bad about that? And I said, it means we continue bombing South Vietnam forever. And that's not acceptable to me. And I wasn't telling him what I was doing at the time, which was copying the Pentagon Papers. Now, the Pentagon Papers, I never thought had a very high chance of averting this, because they did end in 1968 before Nixon came into office. So it was always possible for Nixon to say, that's that policy, that's over, I'm pursuing a different policy, without saying what it was. That's basically what he did. And you know, it doesn't have much relevance to me. Actually, that was Nixon's reaction when the Pentagon Papers came out. As Kissinger said, It really helps us, if anything, a little bit, because it shows it's a Democrats' war. And Nixon had the same attitude. So they weren't unhappy about the papers actually coming out. They made the Democrats look bad, as they deserved to look, and didn't directly impugn Nixon. So what's the use of putting them out? Well, I thought it might help. Initially, I hoped, before Nixon had really committed himself publicly to continuing the war, I hoped that actually revealing this about the Democrats would allow him, if he had any thought of getting out, which I knew was not his main plan, but it might encourage him to say, okay, good war, but the Democrats have screwed this up. They made it hopeless, impossible. I have no choice now but to get out. In short, what Obama more or less did say about Iraq, and should have said about Afghanistan, but didn't when he got in. But he could have said, it's been screwed up, it's hopeless. He called it, Obama now, called it, as opposed to Iraq, which was a dumb war, which he opposed. This was a smart war, a just cause, a necessary war, a good war, a war that had to be continued, and so forth. Very strange thing for him to say, really, because if you're talking about smart and dumb wars, it would be hard to find a dumber war than trying to occupy Afghanistan on the face of the planet. You had the experience of the every empire before it, practically going back to Alexander, and certainly the British and then the Russians, Soviets, had all been defeated by their efforts to occupy Afghanistan. We learned no more from that than we learned from the defeat of the French in Indochina, or the Soviets managed to learn from the defeat of the British before them in Afghanistan. Very hard for one empire to learn from the experience of another. They say, that's those guys. We're very different. We know how to do it. Republicans couldn't even learn from the Democrats in this respect when Nixon came in. And it appears that Democrats can't learn from Republicans either, as we see from Obama. Expanding the war in Afghanistan, approximately the dumbest. I must say I was offended at the beginning for judging wars only by this dumb, smart aspect, both wars being totally wrongful occupations, and as well as hopeless. A lot of you, I know, are learning about Vietnam and its ancient history to you, but Afghanistan is not ancient history. It's going on now. It's remarkably like Vietnam in many respects, despite differences, but the differences are less important than the fundamental similarities of the occupation challenge here. A surprising number, actually, of similarities, with one major difference, of course, that Americans are dying in what turn out to be acceptable numbers. Now, in Vietnam, Westmoreland was under the impression that 500 Americans a week was perhaps an acceptable number, while we learned differently. I heard him say that. But that was too many. And you might think that several thousand Americans might be too many for Afghanistan, but apparently not. Americans are down on the war. They think we should get out. They think it was hopeless, and their attitudes are at this point, about what they were in Vietnam after the Tet Offensive in '68. But the war had 7 years to go then, and it would not have ended then without a lot of luck and various political activities and various things. But Nixon did not have it in mind to end when it did. His term was ended, and that made the war endable. What made it endable in significant part was, but not entirely, not only were protests like the one you had here in Brattleboro the other day. And how many people were involved in that? Anybody here? Let's see the hands. Let me see. Okay, well, I would have thought more. Anyway, one of the people involved, of course, got his picture in the paper here, Randy Keeler, who is, if you've seen the movie, you're aware, is the senator. He's the man who changed my life, along with the woman who's sitting next to him, Janaki Chandra, if you've seen her in the movie, stand up, Janaki. I'm so lucky to have them right here in the neighborhood to learn from, as I did, and to get arrested with. Because if you've seen the movie, you know, or read part of the movie, you know that they changed my life in the not in terms of whether the war was worth fighting or could be won. I was understood by the time I met either of them, before I met either of them, that the answer was no to either of those. And that was true of virtually everybody I was working with in the Pentagon, including right-wingers, real right-wingers, who knew Vietnam, who were just knew the war was hopeless and that we should be out. And yet, as I say, the war had 7 or 8 years to go at that point, and could have been much longer and bigger. The question was, what should you do about that, if you recognize that? And that's where my life was changed, by this Janaki introducing me to the works of Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Stride Toward Freedom, which she recommended to me and I recommend to you, about the Montgomery bus boycott and one other thing. And the work of Barbara Deming, D-E-M-I-N-G, I strongly recommend, Revolution and Equilibrium, and others on nonviolence, that there was another form of power that could be used by the people at large, by withdrawing cooperation, essentially, from a wrongful project. Virtually every one of which, the evil doing, wrongful doing, requires cooperation, and usually cooperation from a lot of people who don't really agree with what's being done, but who do it obediently, or what they conceive of as loyally, patriotically, because their parents want them to, or their family, their teammates, and because not to cooperate would have a social cost. And that cost is real, the cost of ostracism, the cost of losing jobs, friends, careers maybe. And that's enough to keep them in line doing something that they know, even those who know that this is wrongful, that it's harming innocent people, that it's disastrous, that it will lead to no good end. And yet you can get humans to kill other humans for no other reasons than that, the fear of losing status, losing membership in a group, fear of ostracism. Not in principle different from the cliques at high school that we see in the movies, or that I see in the movies that you perhaps experience. That the oppression, the fear of losing your membership, losing the respect and trust of some other people that you want to be respected by and accepted by, is enough to get humans to do most anything. What I've learned at 80, and well, before 80, but not young, is that what you can get people to do by the threat of losing their membership, losing status, losing, being ostracized in various ways, just that, nothing more than that, is not limited to minor things, to the kinds of, let's say, policies in the government that you don't entirely agree with. I mean, you can't be in the government without being willing. I can't be in almost any group without being willing to take part in some petitions, some operations that are not what you would have chosen. You have to make compromises. You have to do various things. But rather, there's really no limit. Taking part in processes that are as bad, wicked, evil, cruel, as you can imagine. You can get people to easily get people to do that from that kind of threat. That's a truth about our species that is, I think, takes a while to learn. You know, generally learn. For what it's worth, I'm telling you now. Don't take anything I say as the last word, believe it because I'm saying it, but take it as a hypothesis and look around and see what limits there are on what people can be gotten to do by threats like that, no more than that. Okay, so what I was learning was that you can withdraw that. You do have a choice. You do have a choice. Many people who do civil disobedience will say later, I had no choice. It's the right thing to do. I had to do it. There was no choice. Interestingly, the people who don't do it, the people who keep silent, the people who take part in something they think is wrong, feel pretty much the same way. I had no choice. If you really press what that means, say, well, I would have lost my job, children's education, my wife, my marriage, my depend on it, my spouse. These are strong considerations, personal considerations. Strictly speaking, they're not absolutely the last word. If what we're talking about is, let's say, starting a wrongful war, or let's say dropping nuclear weapons, or violating the Constitution, you might say, well, losing your job is serious, but it doesn't necessarily outweigh a chance to avert a war, if you think about it. So there is a choice. But truthfully, most people don't ever see those as opposed. The fact is that the idea of losing your job or jeopardizing your marriage or your income or whatever doesn't even arise in your mind generally as a possibility, as something you could do that gives you a choice. It's filtered out. You have a spam filter that says risking job. That even doesn't come to consciousness at all. It goes to the trash without you ever being conscious of it. And so they don't see a choice. That's what a conflict of interest is, really. People who have that conflict of interest generally don't feel a conflict. They don't feel a dilemma. They just assume that certain things aren't worth considering. And that includes anything that involves losing your clearance if you're in the government, losing your job, anything like that, whatever the stakes are. Well, so what Randy and Janaki revealed to me, and Janaki, by her general point of view in the book she led me to read and what I heard from him, Randy, by his example, as somebody whom I barely met until I heard him say that he was going to prison rather than participate in the Vietnam War. And of course, that's a slippery slope when you make decisions like that. 50 years later, here you are, getting arrested in Brattleboro. Not looking that much older than you did 50 years ago. Dorian Gray hairs. No, I'm sure your portrait looks just as good as yours. So, yeah, once you get started getting arrested and find that you don't dissolve, that you're not made of sugar after all, and that you're being arrested and getting the handcuffs on is not actually the end of life. It's high, it almost gets to be a habit. Addictive. So euphoric. So he was going to prison instead of doing, which of course gave me for once the choice. It put in my head the question, what could I do now to help end the war, now that I'm ready to go to prison? And really, the things that seemed worth doing on the whole did not risk prison. They did risk losing clearance, losing job, losing career, and that's what really keeps people in mind. In most cases, it isn't a question of doing something that will send you to prison. In some cases, yes, whistleblowing of some sort, but generally not. But lose other kinds of costs, yes. And once you begin to let that into your mind and then weigh it against what you might be able to do by speaking out, by saying what you really think, or by getting in the way of a process that is wrongful, obstructing it, not violently, without threatening anyone with harm, but obstructing what they're doing, or what they're doing is you think is wrong. That gives you a choice. And that doesn't determine how you will go, how you will choose, but when people face that kind of choice, a fair number of them, I believe, I hope, will actually decide to take the risk, to take the personal risk. And that can be very powerful. See, we're getting, hold on, when is this supposed to be over? I have a lot more to say, but I don't want to overstay.
No, we're okay. We're okay, unless you, well, we have about a half hour.
Half an hour?
Half an hour.
Oh, okay, good. If you have to leave. What's not finished? Some kids may have some questions. Yeah, no,
too.
okay. Let me wrap this up in terms now of what's going on here. I can say that on the day, that you saw the clip there, it was May 3rd, 1972. On May 8th, Haiphong was mined. I remember on May 7th, Max Frankel of the New York Times had a headline in the New York Times, bureau chief. And the headline was, "No one knows what he will do." You know, North Vietnam was escalating, was invading. And the president was making serious decisions, but what were they, what would happen? And the headline was, "No one knows what he will do." Here we are in a democracy, you know, we're all waiting to see what will he do. You know, it's sort of who will win the contest here or something. Nobody thinking of what we thought should happen. I was speaking somewhere to the press, and I remember saying to them, holding that headline up, and saying, "I know what he will do. I know what he will do. I know where he's been heading since 1969, when I worked for him, and for Henry Kissinger as a consultant. And when they were already planning the mining of Haiphong, Mort Halpern had said to me, he was working for Kissinger then, this president will not face re-election without having bombed Hanoi. Without having bombed Hanoi. He will have tried that before he modifies his goals. This was May of '72, he hadn't done that yet. I remember that I called up after the mining, and I said to Mort, who was now, I forget where he was then, he'd left the government, and said, "Well, we've run through the string of the threats that you said." He said, "No, he hasn't bombed Hanoi," which waited until December. But I do remember this, and I don't remember ever mentioning this in public before, but since we've gotten right on top of this. On May 8th, when the mining took place, and I knew that meant decisive escalation in Vietnam, I remember saying to Patricia, my wife, I'd gotten married the year before, and known her for 5 years then, and I said, "I don't know if I can get through this today. I have the feeling that my head my body is coming apart." It was a feeling that I actually don't recall having on any other occasion. I had the feeling of dissolving here, of falling apart. I don't know if I can get through it. Very unusual feeling. Because here what I dreaded now for years was taking place. No way to stop it, nothing did stop it. And to get support for what he was doing, of all things, Nixon had the Plumbers, these Cuban Americans, write letters, be among the letter writing campaign, writing many letters congratulating the president. So they could announce, the White House could announce, we've gotten so many letters. They had a whole, not only the Cubans, of course, they had a huge team of Nixon people who were writing letters to the White House so they could say, we've gotten so many letters in support and only 79 against. So, and it turned out the public did support it on the whole, and it worked out all right for them, and the war went on. And I remember that December, when the bombing was taking place, I'd been on trial now, I've been under indictment for a year and a half at that point. The main trial was about to resume in February, but people asked me, what had the Pentagon Papers accomplished? That had been, remember, this is December '72, the papers came out in June of '71. And I said, nothing, nothing. And the whole anti-war movement has accomplished nothing. I was not one ever for just being inspirational at the expense of what I thought was the truth. And that's the way it looked to me. I said, we're carrying on the heaviest bombing, not just of the war, but of human history at this moment. And I said, '72, I said, the American people this month who had elected a man in November, after Henry Kissinger had said, peace is at hand, peace is at hand, knowing that the bombing lay ahead, the heaviest bombing of the war lay ahead. I said, the American people who voted for Nixon in a landslide had as much influence over what's going on in Indochina right now as the Russian people had over the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. That's where we are. Now, I was wrong, it turned out, and for quite some amazing reasons. On May 8th, when I had this feeling that Everything had failed, but not just a feeling of failure, we're all familiar with that, but a really unusual feeling of coming apart. That was 5 days after these people were in this thing trying to incapacitate me. That was a critical crime that had to be kept secret by Nixon, and had to be kept secret at the cost of obstruction of justice by paying Hunt and the others, not just Hunt, to keep them quiet, keep them lying, perjuring themselves in front of the grand jury. He was likely to get away with that. But in the end, thanks to my trial continuing to be on, so that in the end it continued on so long that when Dean talked about the psychiatrist's office being broken into, the president ordered that not be told to my judge. That was an obstruction of justice. The judge had the right to know that this had been done against me, and later the wiretapping of me and various other illegal things that Nixon had done against me all came out as a result of this. And all of those crimes had to be kept secret. In part, the president then ordered them not to tell the judge of this stuff. 3 weeks, the trial continued on until the Attorney General, Acting Attorney General Kleindienst and Peterson, the assistant, came to him and said, we have to resign if you don't give that information to the judge of this trial, which could have ended weeks earlier if we hadn't had the money. We got some money at the last minute to keep going. And so he sent it on, knowing that he would face impeachment as a result. He discussed this that very day. In fact, he said to Kleindienst, well, they'll say impeachment. Well, then they'll get angry. How they like that? And that's the first word of impeachment on the tapes. He saw it coming. It was a direct result, in other words, of what had happened 5 days earlier in that rally, and other things that had been done against him. That Nixon faced impeachment, had to resign. That made it possible for Congress to the Congress's shutting off the money to remain in effect, because Nixon would have ignored it, just as Reagan ignored Congress shutting off the money for the countries. He just found the money from Saudi Arabia, from Bahrain, from sales of weapons to Iran, various things. He just violated the Constitution and spent money that Congress hadn't appropriated. Nixon would have done that. But Ford wasn't willing to do that. And as a result, the war was endable a year later. So thanks then to a whole lot of people acting in unusual ways. The younger people may or may not remember this, but I'll just have to mention Archibald Cox subpoenaing the White House tapes. Alexander Butterfield choosing to reveal the existence of the tapes as a previous Nixon loyalist. Dean decided to fight the president and go down fighting on this and revealing all this stuff. The Supreme Court, including people Nixon had appointed, voting against him on the tapes. Archibald Cox, as I say, subpoenaing. Elliot Richardson refusing to resign. Ruckelshaus refusing to resign. The Saturday Night Massacre. All these individuals had to act as they did. If one of them had acted differently, Nixon would have stayed in office. And the war would have continued for at least another couple of years and maybe much longer. But with this dozen or so people, a couple of dozen, and my giving the Pentagon Papers actually itself was not a major part of that, but the fear that Nixon had, that's another part of the story, that I had information on him, his administration, beyond the Pentagon Papers. His reasonable fear that I had that led him to take steps to keep me from putting that out, to pursue his secret policy, which would have led to great opposition if it had been known, led him to commit crimes against me, which came to be known. So the threat that I posed to him of telling the truth about his actions was a link in a chain that actually did lead to the ending of the war, the shortening of the war. Actions, not one of those people who did that had any strong reason to believe that it would be effective in any way, in any major sense, let alone as big as it was, including me. And there's no guarantee at all, is what I've just said, that it was. It had to take all these individual initiatives, each person willing to defy a president to some degree, to do that. But they were willing to do it, unusually. And it did have a very big effect. It was, as I told Bill today, in fact, I lucked out in terms of what that action meant as far as what I did. And so did all these others. But part of that chain, of course, as far as I was concerned, started with Jonathan and with Randy. And if I hadn't met either of them, actually none of this would have happened. Each link was essential. It is the case that if I haven't even gone into this, but if I hadn't copied some other documents that went to Nixon, that were of Nixon's era, he wouldn't have taken these crimes. If I'd only copied the Pentagon Papers, he wouldn't have done these crimes. The war would have gone on. But in other words, you can be sure, I'm sure that Randy refusing to send in his draft notice when he changed address, which is what put him in prison for a couple of years, did not do that on the belief that it would end the war, or that it had any great measurable effect on ending the war. And the people here who took part in this protest, I'm sure did not do it in the belief that it had a high chance of protecting us from a tornado hitting the spent fuel rods here, which will make this whole area uninhabitable for thousands of years. The chance that it will have that effect is small, but not zero. And it's worth getting arrested, and it's worth more than that, even. And there's some quotes here that I really like in this story, if you haven't read it. It's a good story. Is the author, is the writer of this story here by any chance? Good story. Reporters who report on this stuff, they have choices to make too as to who they quote and how they frame it. And maybe the editors, I won't say this to the editor, don't tell the editor I said it, but I sense a sympathetic writer here, or at least any colorful quotes here. And it means that a journalist has a chance to put in front of the public's eyes, public education here, some information that they wouldn't get otherwise, that they don't get from Fox News. And they have a chance to do that, and frankly, not many of them take that opportunity. But it is there. Here's a quote. Gary Cheney. Is he here by any chance? Is there a Gary Cheney? Okay. Gary Cheney, first arrest of Vietnam War veteran. Oh, Vietnam War. First arrest. Well, better let them know. From Wyndham. Although he didn't belong to an affinity group, he and a friend had decided to step in. Quote, they think they've won, he said. They've never won. The secret is to never give up. I refuse to be ruled, and I'm never going to give up, Cheney said. Well, that's the spirit. And as I say, here's somebody who maybe went to jail in 1971. So that's 41 years ago. And the other day has not given up. That's essential. And then I love the rest of the quote. Cheney said, the beauty of getting old is they can't do anything to you for too long. I really, what a kindred spirit here. We're from the same era. Because I've been telling myself, being in a detention camp is my retirement plan. And I'm afraid there's not unlikely to happen before this goes on much longer. And really, this may seem romantic, but if I could change places with Bradley Manning, who's looking at a 50-year sentence or so for doing essentially what I did, and having learned to do it at much younger. He's 22 and he copied, thanks to the digital age, even more than I did by a great fraction, multiple. So he's looking at a lifetime in prison. He said to the informant, the chat logs are correct, the one who turned him in, I'm ready to go to prison for life or even be executed. And when I read that, I said, well, that's me 40 years ago. I haven't seen anybody actually say that for a long time, so I feel a very great identification with it. And the thought, and I will say, my belief is that if he goes to prison for that long, which is likely, unfortunately, because he seems to be unwilling to cooperate with the government to put Julian Assange in prison. They clearly, according to his lawyer, want him to make a plea deal that he will cooperate and say what they want him to say, whether it's true or not, about what Julian Assange and WikiLeaks did. And he could almost certainly greatly decrease his sentence by doing that. Still probably serve 5, 6, 7 years, but not 50 years. He's clearly unwilling to do that. I wouldn't criticize him if he did, brother. If he did, you know, let Julian, my friend, another friend, you know, arrange his defense, do the best defense he could, but Bradley's not obligated to be silent about what he actually did, just to protect Julian. But I infer that he feels he did the right thing, Bradley, if he did the right thing, and he thinks that Julian did the right thing in publishing this material, and that Julian should not be where Bradley is, in isolation cell, or now at Leavenworth, in prison. And so he's not willing to cooperate for that. My guess will be that from other experience I know that Bradley, if he spends his life in prison, will not regret what he did, which was to try and reveal a pattern of crimes, of atrocities, of corruption, in a hopeless war, in a wrongful war, to do everything he could, non-violently and truthfully, to shorten that, or to avert it. And even if the war continues, I feel he will not regret it. Why do that's such a, am I sentimentalizing him or idealizing? No, I've known a number of people in that condition. Randy, of course, spent a couple of years, as did many other people, longer than I ever had to. But my friend Mordecai Vanunu in Israel spent 18 years in prison for revealing the Israeli nuclear program was larger than anyone imagined. 11 and a half in solitary confinement in a 6-foot by 9-foot cell. And I believe him when he says, of course I don't regret what I did, of course I would do it again. But I can say, listening to Cheney here, it is in my mind. I would trade places with Bradley on the assumption I don't have 50 years to have to live in that cell. And rather than have him have to spend that amount of time, and he is young enough to do it, I could do it. I don't have 50 years left. And I've learned that it can be useful. In fact, without whoever gave the information to WikiLeaks, let's say Bradley Manning is the one accused of that, without having done that, Ben Ali, the dictator in Tunisia, would still be there. It was the State Department cables that revealed our knowledge of the corruption in Tunisia. There was a critical factor in leading Tunisians to revolt against Ben Ali, in combination with something that happened 3 weeks later. That was one person, Mohammed Bouazizi, who burned himself to death in protest against that, as monks had done and nuns had done in Vietnam. In Vietnam, they brought down the dictator Diem, as the Viet Cong had not been able to do. The violent revolution had not been able to remove that regime. That didn't end the war, but it did bring down the regime. And the burning by Mohammed Bouazizi was crucial in combination with the cables that had been released by Julian Assange and Bradley Manning. Moreover, the revelation in the same State Department cables of atrocities by the U.S., one atrocity in particular, in Iraq, which the U.S. government had denied and claimed was a result of an airstrike, when in fact it was a result of people shooting others in the head who had plastic handcuffs on, like the people the other day here. Clear-cut atrocity. We knew that, it turned out, having denied it all these years. That made it impossible for Maliki, Prime Minister there, to grant immunity to American soldiers from atrocities, as Obama was attempting to do, attempted to get immunity so that he could keep 10, 20, or 30,000 troops in Iraq indefinitely. Obama was trying to do that up till the day they left. And the reason he couldn't do that was the cable made it impossible for Maliki to agree to that, because it was clear that we were unwilling to prosecute anyone for an atrocity, no matter how great. Same issue, you know, is arising now in Afghanistan, thanks to Robert Bates, and who may have a similar effect. So again, here was a leak that might have had no effect at all, no matter how large it was, and yet which had a crucial effect in the Arab Spring starting in Tunisia, and thus in Occupy Wall Street, which direct heir of the occupations of Tahrir Square in Egypt, and getting our troops out of Iraq, which I think was good, was a good thing. So it's worthwhile. As I say, you can't know that you're going to have that kind of effect. What you can know is that it's possible. And given that it's possible, if you're in a chance, by telling the truth, to save a lot of lives, to preserve our Constitution, that's another subject I haven't even gotten to, and I won't get to right now. If you have that chance, by telling the truth, it can be worth very heavy personal price. It can be effective, worth doing, and I honor those of you right now in your lives who will make that choice. Thank you. Okay, I've used up the time. I'm told that I can take one question. My goodness, I've never heard that before. Cool, okay, you got your hand up first.
Thank you.
Okay. Is it on?
You can pick it up and I'll take it right out. There you go.
Do you think that our society could ever change in a way that would make doing something like you did and releasing the Pentagon Papers an easier task? And if so, what would have to happen to change in order for that change to occur? And how probable is it that we can make those changes as a society?
You're saying now? Could it happen now? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay. I have no doubt at all of two important facts that I know from my experience, and not everybody realizes. One, that the government now, like the public, is aware. Many people in the government are aware that many policies going on are disastrous and hopeless, reckless, illegal, one or the other of these things, and perhaps all of them, dangerous, hopeless, reckless, illegal, criminal, murderous, catastrophic. Could be all of those things. That has to do, I could name areas in the area of climate change, for example, and our policies with respect to that, and of course in the public as well. Criminal, like the NSA wiretaps that were going on before Congress, warrantless wiretaps, which have put our entire society under surveillance of a kind that has never existed in human experience before. The government's current knowledge and ability to gain knowledge of your most private events, and your whereabouts at every moment as shown by your GPS and your iPhones and your parking meters, wherever you are and so forth. Your emails, your faxes, your obsolete thing, phone messages, all that. It's like nothing that's ever been seen before, and that was regarded just a few years ago as blatantly illegal and unconstitutional. And Congress has purported to legalize it now with the FISA Amendment Act. They can't really change the Constitution constitutionally by a majority vote like that, but they think they have. Okay, a very illegal, unconstitutional process, putting us in line to be a police state. The possibility of attacking Iran with catastrophic consequences in the Middle East and for the world. The possibility of continuing in Afghanistan for years and years after the public has correctly perceived that we have no business killing people there or dying there. I could name others. Also corporate malfeasance, like Vioxx, like various pharmaceuticals, like the tobacco companies' operations and their lies for years. What I'm saying is, in the corporations and in the government, you can be sure that there are many people who see that as being as wrongful as any critic outside does. One point. The policy that they are part of or represent in the corporation or the group or the government. Second, that there is in fact documentation to that effect. You asked about the Pentagon Papers, but is there the equivalent of the Pentagon Papers or the WikiLeaks exposures? Of course, absolutely. A lot of this stuff, a lot of it is done orally, but which doesn't mean it isn't recorded. But a lot of it is documented, just like the Pentagon Papers, and people have access to it. And although it's a limited number, a fraction of those in a given organization who actually know this stuff, that fraction can be very large. The number of people can be large. Secrets can be kept by thousands of people who know the most sensitive secrets, but who fear to tell them because of their jobs, their careers, their jobs, and so forth. So, third, could it help to avert these dangers? The first two I'm saying are facts. I infer as facts. I'm sure that's true. The documents are there. They are understood by many of the people who have access to them to be evidence of crime or disaster coming. Just like, for example, New Orleans was well understood to be in danger of a hurricane that would overcome the levees. Fukushima had many warnings from inside of what the possibility was. You can be damn sure that the Yankee Corporation has internal analyses in writing of the actual dangers of making this area uninhabitable by a tornado hitting the spent fuel spill runs. In writing, that occurs. There are people who know that inside. Now, what if they told? Now we get, well, here's another fact. If they told and are identified, they will pay a price. Actually, for that sort of thing, it will not be prison. It will not risk prison. But in terms of, Karen Selkwood paid the price of her life by trying to expose something that was not classified, actually, Kerr-McGee. And others have died. But it's more losing job, losing parents, losing marriage, which is very serious, losing income. And that keeps them from telling. That will keep most people from telling that information. That I can almost say is another fact. What if some actually choose, finally, now we get speculative, to come out with it? Like you were saying, could it make a difference? The experience is, it could make a big difference. There's no guarantee that people would act on that information. The people who put out the information about torture, amazingly, had rather little influence. Officially, it ended the torture. In practice, as Bradley Manning revealed from Iraq, or whoever revealed that, we're continuing to turn over people to the Iraqis for torture. We were until the troops got out, thanks to WikiLeaks and Bradley Manning. And it's undoubtedly going on other places. In Afghanistan, I'm sure there are people being tortured right now under Obama, in Bagram, for example, and other places. Mordecai Vanunu, 11.5 years in solitary confinement, had no perceptible effect on Israeli policy. He doesn't regret it, but not because he was effective. So it may have no effect, but it could have enormous effect. It could. And not just to make you, or the person who faces this, feel better and feel you've cleared your own conscience or something, as you might feel simply by resigning. But by going beyond resigning, not resigning, putting out the information while it is timely enough to make a difference, that can make an enormous difference. And so that's why I've been appealing to people now for years in the following terms. If you have knowledge, if you have documents that show, whether in Yankee or elsewhere, that your corporation, your government, your administration, your president, or your agency is lying and concealing, lying because they're concealing wrongful or dangerous policies or unconstitutional practices like the warrantless wiretap. Don't do what I did. Don't wait till the bombs are falling or the tornado gets hit or thousands of people have died before you at least consider doing what I wish I had done as early as 64, 65, when I had those documents before the war got big. Or before, let's say, if I'd had the wiretap stuff, before we'd spent a decade doing this illegal wiretapping. And that is go to the press, go to Congress, put it on the net. If the press won't take it, that's the new possibility. Go to WikiLeaks and put it up, consider it. I can't tell any one individual, you sacrifice yourself, put this ahead of your children's education or whatever it is, your sick child that you're taking care of. I can't tell somebody to take it, but I can say, consider it. Consider what difference you could make if you told what you knew. And I know people think that way, and you will face choices like that. Each of you here will have choices in some group that you're part of in the course of your life, where you know what's being done is not merely misguided or not best, not optimal, not what you would have chosen, but really bad, really bad. And the question is, do you say that? Do you tell the facts? Do you tell it to people who might make a difference? Do you try to organize other people to do it together? Or not? Or do you protect your career? And you'll face that choice more than once, and some of you will act to save a lot of lives, and I thank you for that. Thank you.
I know that most of you need to get on out of here. I have a class now, but it's going to stay right here, at least for a little while. But thank you all for being a great audience. Thank you again.